Margaret Hoover was not the kind of person who walked into a room and made everyone look up. She was quiet. Her shoes did not click on the hospital floor the way the senior nurses' shoes did. Her voice never carried down the hallway. She moved through the ward like someone who had learned, a long time ago, that the best way to do her job was to stay out of everyone's way while doing all of it. She had been a nurse for 11 years. 6 of those years were spent in field hospitals near active combat zones, where supplies were always short, noise was always loud, and sleep was always a luxury. She had seen things that most people never see. She had done things that most people never have to do, and yet, when she returned to work in a regular military medical center, nobody treated her as someone with experience worth respecting. They treated her as someone worth ignoring. The charge nurse on the ward was a woman named Brenda Callis. Brenda had been in her position for 9 years, and she ran her floor the way a landlord runs a building, with a firm sense of ownership and very little warmth. She had favorites, and Margaret was not one of them. Margaret did not laugh at the right moments. She did not bring pastries on Friday mornings. She did not stand near the right people during rounds, and so, in Brenda's mind, Margaret did not matter. Other nurses followed Brenda's lead. They would talk around Margaret at the nurses' station, leaning across her to reach clipboards, finishing conversations that stopped the moment she sat down. One of the younger nurses, a woman named Dana, once looked at Margaret eating lunch alone and whispered to the woman beside her, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "She works like a robot. I don't think she actually cares about anyone." Margaret heard it. She kept eating her sandwich. She had been hearing things like that for years. She had long since decided that she did not come to work to be liked. She came to work because sick people needed someone who knew what to do. The fact that she was not entertaining about it seemed, to her, beside the point. She requested the overnight shifts. Nobody else wanted them. The overnight shift was dark and long, and gave very little opportunity for the kind of socializing that made the day shift feel bearable to most people. For Margaret, the overnight shift was simply the shift where the most difficult patients were, and where the most could go wrong, and where the most careful attention was needed. She did not think about it more than that. On a Tuesday evening in October, a retired general named Arthur Vance was admitted to the ward. His arrival changed the temperature of the whole floor. Brenda came in 20 minutes before her shift was supposed to end, just to be there when he was wheeled in. The surgeons stood a little taller. Even the orderlies moved with more purpose. General Vance was a decorated man. He had served for over 30 years. His name appeared on buildings. Photographs of him with heads of state hung in government offices. And now he was in their ward, recovering from a surgical procedure that had developed a serious infection, and the staff treated his presence the way people treat a rare and important visitor. Brenda assigned the most cheerful nurses to his room during the day. She assigned herself to his first morning check. When his daughter called for an update, Brenda answered personally. The general was treated with every comfort the ward could offer. Margaret was assigned to his overnight rotation. She did not take offense at this. Overnight was her shift. The general was her patient the same as any other. She read his chart with the same care she gave every chart, every number, every note, every shift in medication. She was thorough in a way that looked like slowness to anyone watching, but was actually the opposite. She was building a picture. The first night passed without incident. The general slept, and his vitals stayed where they were supposed to be. Margaret made her notes and moved on to her other patients. The second night was different. At around 2 in the morning, Margaret came into the general's room for a routine check. He was asleep, and nothing on the monitor was alarming. His temperature read slightly elevated, but within a range that could have been explained by any number of things. His breathing was regular. His color, in the dim light, looked fine. But something felt different to Margaret. She stood at the side of his bed for a moment longer than she normally would. She had spent years in tents and field stations where the monitors were unreliable or absent, and where a nurse's observation was the only tool available. She had trained herself, out of necessity, to read patients the way other people read weather, by texture, by feeling, by small signs that did not yet show up in any number. She leaned closer. She watched the rise and fall of his chest. She counted quietly in her head. She placed her hand near his arm without touching it, and felt the warmth radiating from his skin. She looked at the color of his lips, at the way his jaw was set, at the faint sheen of moisture on his forehead. Then she checked his chart again, not for the numbers she had just seen, but for the ones from 6 hours before. She compared them in her mind. She looked at the smallest changes, the ones that would not yet trigger an alarm, the kind that only mattered if you knew what they were building toward. She knew. She had seen this before. In a field hospital, in a patient who had looked stable and then, within 4 hours, had not been stable at all. The infection was moving. The numbers had not caught up to what his body was already doing. She went to the phone at the nurse's station and called the on-call doctor. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding as though she had pulled him out of a deep sleep. She told him what she had observed. She described each finding carefully, the temperature trend, the subtle change in respiratory pattern, the warmth in the skin that was not yet reflected in the recorded readings, and her concern that the infection was advancing faster than the charts currently showed. He told her that the vitals were within acceptable range, and that she should monitor and call again if something changed on the monitor. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a calm and even voice, that she understood his position, and that she wanted to document her concerns in the chart. She said she would be noting the time, her specific observations, and that she had contacted him. She said this without any edge in her voice. She was simply describing what she planned to do. He came in 20 minutes later. He brought a second doctor with him. They examined the general, ran a quick assessment, and ordered additional blood work and a change in medication. The general was moved to a closer monitoring setup for the remainder of the night. Later, reviewing the lab results that came back at 5 in the morning, both doctors agreed that the infection had been advancing in a direction that would have become serious within a few hours. The intervention had happened in the right window. Another few hours without it, and the general's condition would have been significantly harder to manage. No one said much about this during the day shift. There was no announcement. Brenda came in at her usual time and made her usual visit to the general's room, and did not mention Margaret's name. The doctors discussed the updated care plan among themselves. The ward moved forward as wards do, from 1 hour to the next, from one patient to the next. 5 days later, General Vance was sitting up in bed, eating breakfast, and in enough good humor to ask questions about who was taking care of him. He was the kind of man who asked those questions genuinely. He had spent his career in environments where the person standing next to you was the one keeping you alive, and he had never forgotten the importance of knowing that person's name. He asked Brenda, who came in with a warm smile and a readiness to accept the credit, who had been with him during his second night, the night his care plan had changed. Brenda paused. She said it was a collaborative team effort. The general looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Was it a woman?" Quiet voice. She didn't say much, but when she spoke, she was very specific. Brenda said she would find out. Margaret was in the middle of her end-of-shift notes when one of the younger nurses came to get her. She looked up, surprised. She was not often called anywhere for anything that was not a clinical matter. She walked into the general's room and stood near the doorway. He looked at her for a long time, not in a searching way, but in the way a person looks at something they are trying to place, not the face, but something behind it. Something familiar in the way a person holds themselves. "I think we have met before," he said. She said, quietly, that she did not think so. He said he did not mean recently. He said he meant years ago. He said there was a field hospital, and a tent, and a night when he had been certain he was not going to make it, and there had been a nurse, just one, and she had not wasted a single word, and she had done what needed to be done with her hands while saying only, "Stay with me, I have done this before." Margaret was still. She said, "That was a long time ago." He said he knew. He said he had never learned her name. He had been transported out before he was fully conscious, and had spent years thinking about the person who had kept him alive in that tent, whose name he had never been given, whose face he could not fully remember. And now she was here, he said, standing in his doorway again. The story, when it came out, did not change Margaret's daily routine much. She still worked overnight. She still ate alone. The ward did not transform into a place where she was suddenly celebrated. People are not always capable of that kind of change all at once. But some things shifted. The on-call doctor who had hesitated on the phone before coming in stopped hesitating when she called. The younger nurses, including Dana, began watching the way Margaret moved through a room, the way she stood at a patient's bedside and was simply present. And they began to understand that this was not coldness. It was something else entirely. It was a kind of attention that had been trained by years of not having anything but itself to rely on. One evening, a junior nurse named Rosa stopped Margaret in the hallway and asked if she would be willing to explain what she had noticed about the general that night, what she had seen that the monitors had not yet shown. Margaret looked at her for a moment, then said yes. They sat together at the nurse's station for 40 minutes, and Margaret walked Rosa through every small observation, every comparison, every piece of the picture she had been building in her mind. She did not make it sound like talent. She made it sound like practice. She said the most important thing was to never stop looking, just because the numbers said everything was fine. Rosa listened to every word. General Vance, in a letter he sent to the hospital administration before his discharge, wrote about Margaret by name. He described both events, the tent and the ward, with the kind of precision that suggested he had been thinking about them for a long time. He described her as a nurse who did not need an audience to do excellent work. He said that in his experience, the people who did the most important things were often the people nobody was watching. The letter was filed. The administration acknowledged it. A framed copy was eventually hung in the break room, though nobody made a ceremony of it. Margaret saw it one morning when she came in early for her shift. She read it once. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee and went to begin her rounds. Her patients were waiting.